Imagine someone presents you a green-haired mermaid and asks you to adjudicate between it and a blonde one. Well, it seems that even incompatible answers propagate freely. It doesn't really matter how one disagrees about a fantasy. Positivism moved the question to where it should have an answer: propositions of the scientific sphere. Listen to them once again. In order to make this problem intractable, one would have to prove that confirmation by fact does not teach one single lesson. And that confirmation by language, for example, that bachelors are unmarried, would not be tautological, as if one could learn it from the church and another from a heretical convention, and then disagree. Now look at the positivist refutation story with another look. See how strong their case was at the beginning. This is the story I will tell across this series.
Series will take you all the way to the collapse of logical positivism, because you already live in a post-positivist world. But to understand how we arrived here, you will have to follow the difficult path, asking the hard questions. How necessity could be richer than tautology, without becoming an arbitrary, pluralistic proliferation of essential necessities. How could one study different versions of possibility and necessity, like inspecting different inner mechanisms, each producing those as objective divergences? How could it make sense of truths that are necessary, yet known only a posteriori? Those are the questions that post-positivist philosophy had to answer. Positivism therefore makes not one, but two distinct moves towards the inspectability of meaning. The first connects a sentence to the experiential conditions under which its associated proposition, the abstract partition of possible world carvings it represents, would be computed as true. The second is more abstract. It makes the very route from sentence to verification itself inspectable, by requiring that it converge on a single admissible source. This rules out both propositions that could be true in multiple, non-equivalent ways, and propositions claimed to be necessary without their negation yielding a determinate contradiction. For example, necessities grounded in obscure metaphysical connections that are neither verifiable nor falsifiable. The consequence is profound. Empirical sentences must receive assignable truth values through world-directed feedback, but necessary truths must ultimately reduce to analyticity. Every genuine necessity must converge on a single logical truth whose denial yields contradiction. Disagreements about necessity cannot be adjudicated by appealing to different bodies of theoretical background knowledge or to competing metaphysical commitments. Otherwise, necessity itself would cease to be publicly inspectable and would lose its role as a common semantic anchor.
But the crisis of formalism did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in stages. The first major crack appears in Frege. Gottlieb Frege realized that logical form alone does not individuate the thought expressed by a sentence. Frege's lesson is that logical reasoning depends not merely on preserving form, but on preserving the distinctions that correctly identify what a proposition is about. Logic, therefore, cannot consist merely in manipulating formal proxies. When we infer, we are preserving connections between thoughts, not merely rearranging symbols. That was the first crack in formalism. The second crack came several decades later. Gödel showed that even after you have fixed the formal machinery, proof still fails to capture truth. Formal structure by itself cannot determine the semantic object it is supposed to organize. Now comes the positivist response, the logical positivist response. Logical positivism accepts that formal syntax is not enough. But instead of abandoning the project of logical reconstruction, it asks a different question. If form cannot determine content, not by itself, what can? The answer is not metaphysics, nor intuition, nor hidden essences. Instead, logical positivism turns to an older empiricist idea, inherited from David Hume. A proposition acquires its identity through the way it can be corrected. If a proposition is empirical, its revision must converge on one pattern of verification. If it is analytic, its denial must converge on one determined contradiction. Analyticity is therefore no longer merely a feature of meanings, it becomes a criterion for selecting one inferential path over competing alternatives.
And now comes the paradox. We usually think the perfect translator should disappear, that the translation shouldn't sound like the translator at all. But imagine someone goes even further.
But let's not suppose now we are dealing with an impossible problem. For centuries, translation was treated as a technical problem, not the technical problem of words, but of preserving thought. John Dryden gave what became the canonical formulation. A translation, he said, should produce the text which the foreign poet would have written had he been composing in one's own tongue. It sounds almost obvious until you ask the next question. How would you ever know? What exactly survives the journey from one language to another? Certainly not the words, not the grammar, not even the intentions, at least not as inspectable objects. What translators were really searching for was something much more precise, an anchor capable of telling us that two different texts still belong to the same thought. Technically, the question becomes almost computational. Suppose both the original and the translation receive exactly the same new piece of knowledge. Will they propagate toward the same conclusions? Will they revise themselves in the same way? Or can they drift into incompatible interpretations while still claiming to mean the same thing? That is. In the 20th century, logical positivism believed it had found the best answer available, not by looking inside people's minds, but by borrowing two anchors from the empiricist tradition. One anchor tied language to the world, the other tied language to logic. A meaningful sentence had to know where factual correction came from, and it had to know how logical consequences propagated through the rest of the theory. If those two anchors remained fixed, then meaning could move across languages without becoming arbitrary. This is the doctrine that disagreements over necessity are ultimately trivial. Two people may appear to defend incompatible accounts of what is impossible, but for the positivist, there is no objective remainder once the meanings are fixed. They have simply adopted different linguistic frameworks or settled different conventions. There is no further fact of the matter over which they could be disagreeing. Fourth, to see how strong this is, suppose you weren't a positivist in the 1930s. How could you challenge the circle without reopening the door they'd shut? Allow more than one decomposition of necessity, and don't you invite back the old metaphysics? Philosophers disputing essences and possible worlds, the way medieval thinkers disputed angels and forms, treating necessity as natural history to explore.
Suppose you are given an impossible assignment. Design a philosophy that gets rid of metaphysics without becoming incapable of talking about meaning. Well, we'll still have to explain why some sentences make sense and others don't. Take a simple example. The sentence, "The number 7 is cold." Most philosophers before the 20th century would have had no trouble explaining why that's impossible. Numbers simply aren't the kind of thing that can have temperatures. They would appeal in one way or another to the nature of numbers themselves, to abstract objects, essences, categories, or some ideal structure of reality. But here, in my challenge, you are not allowed to do any of that. No hidden realm of abstract objects, no essences, no necessary structures behind language, no metaphysical facts waiting to be inspected. So, now what? How can you still distinguish nonsense from genuine impossibility? At first glance, it looks like you have paid an enormous price. Without metaphysics, semantic judgment itself seems to become blind. But Rudolf Carnap thought otherwise. He argued that nothing has to be inspected behind language because nothing is hiding there. The impossibility of the number 7 is cold is not discovered by examining some abstract object called 7. It comes entirely from the logical organization of our language. Why should syntax settle those questions in advance instead of becoming one hypothesis among others? Those questions, eventually transformed philosophy. This series is about both sides of that story. Why logical positivism was so compelling, why it dominated for decades, and why so many philosophers ultimately concluded that its greatest strength concealed its deepest weakness.
Next, why positivism thought a theory of meaning could also settle how metaphysics gets excluded from meaningful discourse. The technical task was narrow. Rule out any sentence whose method of verification couldn't rule out incompatible outcomes. This also sets the stage for understanding why logical positivism was later criticized as dogmatic. Its criterion excluded too much without fully justifying why it had to. Its central achievement was to require that the truth value of a proposition never reverse arbitrarily as it entered more complex reasoning. But it never explained why there should be only one legitimate way of partitioning the dependencies that guarantee the stability. Why should reason privilege one canonical route of revision over another if several preserve the same non-inversion principle? That question gradually undermined the positivist program. Developments in philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and AI suggest that cognition has no intrinsic commitment to a unique decomposition of semantic dependencies. Human thinkers routinely organize, revise, and stabilize meaning through heterogeneous conceptual resources, sometimes statistical, sometimes causal, sometimes functional, and sometimes even overtly metaphysical. Quick revisitation before the autopsy. Logical positivism's core promise was a criterion of meaning. A statement is meaningful only if it can, in principle, be verified by checking which facts and theoretical backgrounds are doing the work of holding it. That gives you two ways to check this. If a background theory plus the facts assigns a statement the value true, that assignment can't reverse anywhere downstream unless either the facts change or the theory itself gets revised. Which means disagreement about meaning isn't some mysterious fog two people are lost in. It's checkable. You look at which facts and which theoretical commitments are actually doing the work for whoever's using the sentence. And that's exactly what does the sorting for you. A metaphysical proposition can't be held to that standard, because the anchor it needs, the thing fixing this is what it says and not that, isn't supplied by any fact and isn't supplied by any theory. It's supplied by speculative projection. Someone says, the earth will never be treated by God as an ellipse. Ask what's holding that assignment in place. Not a physical fact, no observation touches it. Not a theory, no trajectory of inference feeds into it. What's holding it is just a picture of how the person thinks the world ought to be arranged. Pull the projection out, and the sentence has nothing left pinning its meaning down. Now, of course, let's remind ourselves of one of the most serious blows ever landed on the standard of empirical confirmation. Hempel showed that confirmation alone does not carry testifying supercredibility. A sentence can be confirmed by something that counts as evidence for it in name only, while telling you nothing distinctive about it at all. All ravens are black, and all non-black things are non-ravens, are the same claim, restated so by the rule positivism itself relies on. Anything that confirms one confirms the other, which means one could do research on birds based on evidence that never came near a bird at all. Open a drawer, find a red shoe, not black, not a raven, and by the rule, you've just confirmed something about ravens. So, how much of positivism was actually refuted? We can say this much with confidence. Its central ambition had to be let go. If we wanted an anchored theory of science, a theory that could say when meaning survives translation, revision, transformation, we weren't going to find those anchors in pure empiricism alone. Quine showed the logical anchor collapsed into the framework it was supposed to justify. Hempel showed the empirical anchor smuggled in intuitions it never accounted for. But richer grammars were available, richer anchors, modal notions, dispositional properties, natural kinds, sat waiting in places positivism had refused to look. It refused help from metaphysics, and that refusal was its downfall. So let's recap and be precise about what actually ended. What was over was not the dream of a solution to interpretation. What was over was the dream that this could be done in a neutral, non-metaphysical way.
So the case for the prosecution turns mid-trial into a case for the defense. If facts settle some things and logical form settles a few more, in between those two nets a whole layer of judgment about projection, relevance, and necessity falls straight through, then something has to be doing that job, and it's been philosophy's job all along.